The year is 2015. You're home from school and you want to boot up the computer to play some Minecraft or some League of Legends or whatever game your friends are raving about today. You hit the start button on your computer and hear the hard drive whine up in a raggedy breath and decide it's probably gonna need a while to wake up. You go fetch some water. You microwave the leftovers, you take the dog for a walk, you do your homework, you get into college, you graduate college, you come back, and yeah, still not booted up yet. Now, I don't think it's anyone's hill to die on that these hard drives aren't an antique of a time before SSDs were everywhere. It was the same thing for floppy disks when hard drives came out. Of course, they still have their uses, but with just how affordable SSDs have gotten in the past 10 years, it's really a no-brainer to be using SSDs wherever you can. We don't even ship system builds with hard drives in them anymore, not a single one. At this point, they just aren't good enough for even the average consumer.
So just how affordable have they gotten? Well, in 2015, a 1TB SATA SSD would have had your wallet out for $320. Meanwhile, in 2024, a 1TB M.2 NVMe SSD can be as low as $50. Not to mention, the SATA interface is limited to 600 megabytes a second as compared to even Gen 3 M.2's almost sextupling that speed. For the uninitiated, there are three mainstream types of SSDs as of late: SATA SSDs, M.2 Gen 3, and M.2 Gen 4. I'll be handing it over to Benji for the next bit.
SATA SSDs are the slowest of the bunch. As mentioned before, the SATA interface is limited to 600 megabytes per second. So even with the fastest SSD running on this platform, this will be your bottleneck. Another point to consider is the space and wiring requirements. SATA SSDs require a location to mount them in your case. They also demand a cable running to your motherboard and a SATA power connection to your power supply. This can increase the clutter in your builds and generally is a pain in the butt.
I personally have two hard drives and a SATA SSD kicking around in my personal rig, and the wiring situation round back is yeah, maybe let's not talk about it. M.2 SSDs skip this cabling mess and instead plug straight into the motherboard. No fluff. Modern motherboards will almost always have at least one M.2 slot, regardless of the form factor, with some even jamming 4, even up to 5 of these connectors in. The main point of difference between M.2 SSDs is the generation. At the moment, we're up to Gen 5 on M.2s, which can reach up to a mind-melting 16,000 megabytes a second, but they're almost double the price of Gen 4 SSDs, and realistically, you won't be able to access that higher end of transfer speeds, as most use cases won't be able to make use of it anyways.
Also to note is that Gen 5 M.2s get hot, much more so than previous generations, and will require some sort of cooling to ensure thermal stability and longevity of the drive. Some Gen 5 M.2s ship with big heatsinks attached to them, but if you're putting them in your PC, you probably won't be able to use them instead of the included heatsink on your motherboard. As of 2024, the viability of Gen 5 M.2 SSDs just isn't there yet. Most mid, even slightly older high-tier motherboards don't have a Gen 5 socket, so you still be constrained to Gen 4 speeds. What do you want from me? Actually, losing your mind. As of 2024, the viability of Gen 5 M.2 SSDs just isn't there yet. Most mid, even slightly older high-tier motherboards don't have a Gen 5 slot, so you'll be constrained to Gen 4 speeds.
Which leads us back to Gen 4. Gen 4 M.2s are the go-to for now. This one we have here is the XPG S70 blade that XPG has kindly sent over for this video. Gen 4 SSDs like the S70 reach the upper theoretical limit of the Gen 4 connector, with read speeds of 7400 megabytes a second and 6800 megabytes a second for write. Then there's only about 400 megabytes of headroom before we hit that upper limit of the Gen 4 connector. The next most common M.2 on the market is the Gen 3s. The upper limit of Gen 3 is 3500 megabytes a second, which is still blazing fast for most applications, with the added benefit of being quite cost effective. Now, as mentioned before, hard drives are still a viable option for situations where you need a large amount of storage for less often accessed data. I still have a 6TB hard drive kicking around for my photography and videography archives, along with the movies and shows that I've decided to keep. For use cases like this, a hard drive is more than capable and it's been totally fine. But when we're talking about games and operating systems, the story changes quite a bit. Booting to Windows from a hard drive is a ghastly affair, guys. Where SSDs bring you to your desktop in usually less than 20 seconds, hard drives can take up to 2 minutes to crank its gears into motion. Game loading times also beckon the saving grace of SSDs, as in most single-player titles, the loading times can be cut in half when you're using an SSD as compared to a hard drive.
The use of M.2s isn't limited to the PC world either. The PS5, as we've got here, can take M.2 SSDs to expand internal storage. The S70 blade here is advertised to support PS5 natively, and once we've installed it, the PS5 automatically recognizes it and starts initializing. We would suggest attaching the included heatsink to ensure thermal stays within limits and for stable performance.
Loading times were comparable to the PS5's original internal storage, and it works flawlessly. Now, we do have to disclose that in our research, the XPG S70 blade has been prone to failures as reported by users on Reddit, citing the problem laying with the controller, the Inogrid IG5236. There are a few other drives that use this controller with the same reported issues. Firmware updates were suggested to fix these issues, but we were unable to confirm this as there is sparse information at best on firmware updates and the fixes that come along with it. ADATA, XPG's parent company, has a software that allows for updating the firmware of SSDs, and if you're picking one up, make sure you run that firmware program to minimize the chance of a drive failure.
For reference, our S70 came with firmware 3.2.j.je loaded on it. What that means, when that firmware was implemented, or whether or not that fixes the issues, aren't clear, as there's no documentation to reference. We reached out to XPG for comment on these ongoing issues, and our XPG rep was able to clarify that this issue has been solved with firmware updates. If you've updated the firmware and still getting issues, please be sure to let us know in the comments below.
The S70 blade is on the lower end of the price range for the speeds that are advertised. In our testing, the S70 was able to replicate those speeds on the PC, but on the PS5, the system reported only 6,500 megabytes a second of read speeds. However, it did the same on a Samsung 990 Pro that we also tested, so it may have just been a limitation of the PS5's M.2 interface instead. This is the original PS5 from its release and not the slim model. Also, when you're picking an SSD for your PS5, you need to make sure that it's a Gen 4x4 model, otherwise the PS5 straight up won't detect it. For full transparency, we weren't paid by XPG to showcase this S70, though they did send it to us at no cost to facilitate this video.
Would we recommend the S70 blade? Maybe, but SSDs frequently go on sale. As of the start of October, the Samsung 980 Pro, a drive with a stellar reputation, is on sale for the same base price of the S70 over on Amazon. That being said, when on sale, the S70 blade would be a compelling choice for the savvy-minded buyer. Just make sure to update the firmware. Overall though, we would recommend upgrading to an M.2 SSD if you're still on an antique hard drive to instantly give your setup a performance boost. Just make sure to check what your motherboard supports and purchase accordingly.
And that's it, folks. Thanks very much for sticking around. It has been a pleasure taking up your waking hours. Hit the like button if you found this video useful, subscribe if you haven't already, and we'll see you next time.